As student debt in the United States surpasses $1 trillion, we ask what's led to the rising cost of higher education and what does it mean for the struggling economy? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The cost of higher education in the United States has been referred to as the ball and chain that follows many Americans to the grave. Debt from student loans has exceeded an estimated $1 trillion for the first time, surpassing credit card debt. More and more recent graduates are having difficulty finding jobs to help them pay off their loans. It's a burden that some economists say is threatening any economic recovery in the United States. And it's not just the impact on young people. Americans 60 years and older still owe more than $30 billion in student loans. Consumer advocates say that debt collectors go as far as seizing their Social Security checks. The cost of college education, which is 6 times more expensive today than it was 30 years ago, is only expected to rise. John Terrett met one student saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in debt.
Ray Ann studied hard at university and has a good job. But looking ahead, she sees nothing but a burden of debt in her life.
We were always told, if you don't go to college, you're not going to make any money. You're not going to live the American dream.
Her university course cost more than $30,000 a year. And to pay for it, she did what her college advised and took out student loans.
You're supposed to take out these student loans because it's good debt. And when you graduate, you will make $40,000 and you will be able to pay off these loans quickly.
When Ray Ann graduated, she had $70,000 in student debt. She's already paid down $14,000, but the terms of her loans mean that 5 years after graduating, she still owes just over $106,000 for her education. Debt forgiveness and allowing students to dump their debt through bankruptcy protection are 2 initiatives before Congress and supported by the Center for American Progress, as is a much more hands-on approach by the universities in helping students to manage their debt.
Let students know along the way just how much debt they've taken on, what that means in terms of a monthly payment, and then how much they're going to pay overall.
It's been suggested that all this debt will crimp the lifestyles of students so much once they're in the workplace that they won't be able to afford homes, cars and holidays, further damaging the limping US economy. In other words, a bubble of student debt that's about to burst. Economist Dean Baker was among a handful of people who forecast the housing bubble bursting in 2008. He says if there is a bubble of student debt, it may well burst, but it won't wreak havoc like the housing one did.
At its peak, the housing market was over $20 trillion. That was driving the economy. When we talk about student loan debt, we're just now around $1 trillion. Now, that's a big sum, but in a $15 trillion economy, it's not that big a deal, and it's certainly not all going bad at once.
Ray Ann says if she knew then what she knows now, she'd never take out a student loan, would attend a local college and live at home.
That society benefits from a well-educated citizenry. And it's sad that we don't value that and that we're putting such a high price tag on being educated.
John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So what's led to the steep increase of student debt and what does it mean for the struggling US economy? To discuss all this, we're joined from Seattle, Washington by Alan Collinge, founder of StudentLoanJustice.org and the author of The Student Loan Scam. Here in studio, we have Pat Garofalo, Economic Policy Editor for ThinkProgress.org at the Center for American Progress, and by Victor Sanchez, President of the United States Student Association. Pat Garofalo, though, we heard Dean Baker and John Terrett's report there say, look, this is a serious issue, but let's not go too crazy here. It's not going to be like the mortgage meltdown. How serious is this? Are we in danger of exaggerating the seriousness of what's happening right now?
I think there's a point there that it's not going to cause the kind of catastrophic financial collapse that the mortgage meltdown did, only because private banks don't have, relatively speaking, that much in student loan assets. So seeing the student loan bubble
pop... But they do have a piece of the action, don't they?
They do, but we're talking billions of dollars, not the trillions of dollars that they held. So you wouldn't see banks fail, you wouldn't see a kind of $700 billion bailout necessary. However, at this point, with where the U.S. economy is and trying to recover from that financial crisis, student loan debt is going to cause us a lot of problems in getting the kind of growth that we need, getting to the kind of sustained growth, because the people that we're counting on to drive that growth, to spend money, to go out and form new households and buy products and buy cars and start their own families, are instead going to be at home, not doing those things because all of their money is going towards paying off their student loans.
Victor Sanchez, you're very much on the front line of the protests and the activism currently underway, but very much connected to the Occupy movement over the last year. Give us a sense then of the effect of this debt burden and how in particular in the current economic conditions, how particularly affecting it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have students that are torn between, making a decision about paying rent, buying food, doing laundry, buying books, or paying back, their student loan debt. And I think right now we don't live in a society in which that should be the case. I think in being in a country where the richest country in the world, we should be able to afford to fully fund our students and our future, right, to go into institutions of higher learning, and instead we're burdening them with about an average of $25,000 in debt.
And we should probably point out, I mean, there are protests going on all around the country. I mean, just yesterday in Santa Monica, I mean, as usual, the police decide the best way to deal with students is pepper spray in the face. But this is about tuition fees and the student debt burden. It's a nationwide movement.
Yeah, no, and it is, and I think it's growing. I mean, just last week, I was actually arrested with 35 other students who were a part of a conference that came here on behalf of the United States Student Association that was trying to demand a meeting with the CEO of Sallie Mae, Albert Lord, and
which is the main sort of
which is the #1 profiteer of student loan debt on the private lending industry side. And to no avail, we got no response. Instead, the only response was them calling the police. And so,
Alan Collinge, then, as we've been hearing there, it's not just students and former students or recently graduated students that are being affected. It is also whole families and senior citizens, those who co-sign for these loans and so forth. Houses are being repossessed, pensions are being garnered. How serious is that situation?
It's very serious. In fact, I counsel all students to never ask for, and I tell their parents to never offer to co-sign on a student loan for their children, because indeed, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and other friends and family are finding their nest eggs very threatened in a very real way. And this is due to the fact, fundamentally because there are no bankruptcy protections associated uniquely with student loans. This is given rise to a predatory lending and collection mechanism where not only do the lenders make more money on defaults than loans that remain in good stead through their collection activities, but also the guarantors and even the federal government are making more money on defaulted loans than loans which remain in good stead.
We'll develop some of those ideas.
This drives the sticker price up, which obviously has reached some sort of a breaking point. And we are seeing a social impact, which is devastating. One of the earlier comments is that, well, the home mortgage industry is 10 times larger. That's true, but remember, the federal government guarantees a nearly full book value on most of that debt, where, at least there was a house backing up the debt in the other case. So there's a taxpayer risk. But also, while we won't see, the bottom line ticker prices necessarily affected by the collapse of the borrowers for student loans, it is bursting in the living rooms across the country, and it's devastating in many incalculable ways.
Pat Garofalo, then, does that mean that this idea of the American dream, that you do go to university and then you have some class mobility, particularly for middle class and lower income families, that the cost-benefit analysis perhaps doesn't work anymore? The fact is you might be much worse off actually as a result of trying to live that dream.
I think it's a complicated question, because while that's true, and while we have seen our educational attainment fall far behind other countries in the last few decades where we used to lead the world, we're not in the top 10 anymore in terms of percentage of our population getting a degree. It is still the case that people with a degree make substantially more money than those that don't. So you're in this between a rock and a hard place, essentially, where you want to pay to get the degree in order to get that wage premium, because it's still college-educated people make far more than people who only have a high school diploma. But at the same time, in order to get that wage premium, you need to take out these gigantic loans. So there's really no good answer.
Alan Collinge, let's start at the basics though quickly. I don't know if you're able to do this in as quickly, in as succinct a way as possible. Give us an idea of how the system does work there, the range of loans on offer, the subsidised, the unsubsidised loans, the federal loans, the private loans, the Stafford loans and so forth. How does all this fit together? Are the terms explained? Is this a clear system in the first place?
Well, first of all, there's private and federal loans. Private loans stand on their own. There's nobody backing them up in case of default. Federal loans are guaranteed and in fact made now by the federal government. Both of these lending systems have obviously making money on interest is their main source of revenue, but they also have grown to make substantial amount on defaults and penalties and so forth. And as I explained earlier, it has become, in fact, a reversed and perverted incentive where the lender's interest is now counter to the borrower's interest.
And this is why the term's predatory.
Fundamental problem that I see, which drives inflation, drives corruption, and quite frankly, governmental, I would say laziness, but it's more than that. It's complete inaction, and it is reprehensible and intolerable. But it should never be the case that a lender makes more money on defaulted loans than a loan that remains in good
Alan,
stead,
I mean,
they will behave accordingly.
There was that interesting example again in John Terrett's story there of Rayanne. So she leaves university with $70,000 in student debt. She pays $14,000, but then 5 years after graduating, now she owes $107,000. Pat, I mean, how does that work? And is that part of this idea that this is some huge predatory lending scam in some ways? Though?
It's pretty remarkable how that works.
Well, I don't know Rayanne's specific case history, but certainly if there was a default involved, that sounds about right. There are actually far worse examples. Often students are never even contacted after they leave school. They don't know who to pay. They're never contacted, and instead their loans are thrown into default without the borrower even attempting to contact them. There's no appeals process for defaulted loans, and upon default, the loans essentially explode with penalties and fees and so forth.
Pat Garofalo,
every dollar that the
I mean, given though that these loans, at least the federal loans, are guaranteed by the government, why is there such a need though for such high interest rates, such onerous penalties, such a harsh collections repayment scheme? You miss one payment, you're delinquent. You miss 9, you're liable for the entire sum up front with more penalties and so on. And why is there any need for this if it's all guaranteed by the government in the first place?
That's a great question. I don't think there is much of a need for it. And if you actually look at it, federal student loans are much cheaper than private loans, and right now the rate is much lower than it has been. But if the
government's being lent this money on very nice terms.
And actually, that's the point I was just about to make, is even with the historically low interest rates on federal student loans, the government is still making money because it can borrow so cheaply. So there's really no argument for the sorts of activities we've been seeing. Garnishing Social Security wages was something that Bloomberg News reported this week, because you can't. The federal student loan program, when borrowers are repaying, is profitable by itself.
But is there really any evidence that the government is, has taken that into account and is thinking, hey, we can make some money out of this, or is it just simply, the incompetence of?
It's a lack of oversight. It's a lot of factors. It's Congress continually coming in and mucking about with the program. I think those are the main things. But if you look at it, the fact that the federal government can make money running a sound, safe, fair lending program, and yet they're still doing all the things that they're doing, is highly problematic.
Victor Sanchez, I mean, when you look at the system, I mean, how did we get to this point? Clearly, the purpose of the student loan system when it was instituted in the 60s was to open up opportunity. It wasn't to perhaps make a profit or to, either for the government or for other agencies or, banks and so forth. What happened along the way?
Yeah, I mean, good intentions only can go so far. And I think basically what you have is the rising cost of attendance, right? Because you have state budgets and state coffers because of lack of revenues that are kind of going down. And I think with that, you also have the cutting of state grant aid. So scholarships and grant opportunities for students is also, on a lower decline. And then also with that, you have a gap, right? And so as cost of attendance is going up because of the lack of state support, on top of the lack of grant aid programs, you have this gap now that exists that needs to be made up by something. And that something, more increasingly over the years has become student loans. And so, the private-public balance of it all is what kind of makes up this $1 trillion. But I think, one, it's an unsustainable model of funding our systems of higher education. Two, I mean, we believe that, one, education should be free to begin with, right? And none of this stuff should burden our society, at the end of the day.
So it's not so much that there's a confluence of events this year of unemployment, austerity, predatory lending, of course, in the past, and so forth. And it's not all of these factors. It was a pretty rotten system to begin with, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean it's also the product of a lot of short-term thinking in terms of trying to put a bandage over a much larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed in a much wholesome kind of way.
Alan Collinge, though, I mean, so we have this there is this confluence of circumstances right now of unemployment and low wages and the difficulty of paying back loans and so forth. Whose idea was it to take to remove any consumer protection for those who face paying back student loans? In particular, the inability to have your student loan waived if you go bankrupt. I mean, where did that? I mean, clearly that was in 2005, I guess, in the bankruptcy law. Whose idea was that? Who stuck that in?
This actually goes back to 1977, believe it or not, when Sallie Mae, newly formed Sallie Mae executives, essentially, and probably the Consumer Bankers Association, but quite frankly, everybody in Congress as well, sort of liked the idea. The premise they gave for removing bankruptcy protections was that students were filing en masse promptly after graduation. Well, it turns out with 40 years of hindsight, the benefit, that never happened. Far less than 1% of student loans were discharged in bankruptcy court when it was completely allowable. So it started with Sallie Mae, and it was a long-term project for them. And as you mentioned, ultimately, bankruptcy was removed from private student loans, which is essentially like removing bankruptcy protections from credit cards, for all intents and purposes, in 2005. And so, I guess the culprits were Sallie Mae, Albert Lord, and so forth. But I can't say that Congress really put up much of a fight. And indeed, the Democrats, with a supermajority a couple years ago, couldn't even get bankruptcy protections returned to private loans, which absolutely should have never happened.
But do you think, Pat Garofalo, do you think that sort of led to this particularly predatory atmosphere? Because now the lenders know, well, we can chase people till they're dead, basically, for this money, and those around them as well. And in fact, there's also an argument that perhaps the growth in for-profit colleges has grown up now, precisely, not necessarily to impart a good education, perhaps not impart any education, but simply to take advantage of this predatory lending system that's grown up as a result of the lack of bankruptcy protection.
That's a fantastic point to bring up, because that sector in and of itself is a huge problem. If you look at students who attend for-profit colleges, default in much higher rates.
And these are the poorest, more poorer, blue-collar...
The way the for-profit college sector sells itself is that it's providing higher education to people who couldn't otherwise get it, that it's going to go to the students no one else wants and give them the higher education that they can't get elsewhere. But if you look at the data, it turns out that the degrees are essentially worthless. People aren't getting the jobs that they are supposedly trained for. These students default in much higher numbers, and the education is much more expensive compared to the same degree at a community college. So charging outrageous rates. And at the same time, these institutions are, for the most part, living off the federal government because the students get these loans, take them, hand them over to the for-profit schools, default on them, and that's then all on the taxpayer.
I see Goldman Sachs went in heavily into for-profit education, so presumably there was some money to be made. Well, clearly there's a problem. President Obama has referred to the rising cost of higher education in his annual State of the Union speech in January. Let's see what he has to say.
We can't just keep subsidizing skyrocketing tuition. We'll run out of money. States also need to do their part by making higher education a higher priority in their budgets. And colleges and universities have to do their part by working to keep costs down. So let me put colleges and universities on notice. If you can't stop tuition from going up, the funding you get from taxpayers will go down. Higher education can't be a luxury. It is an economic imperative that every family in America should be able to afford.
So President Obama, they're clearly honing in on this idea of tuition fees as being a major cause. And, of course, many countries around the world offer a free college education, not so in the US. US public universities have steadily raised their cost of tuition. For a university degree in 1985, a student in the US paid about $3,500 a year in current dollars. In 2010, the average price tag jumped to more than $21,000. That's a 40% hike over the rise of inflation. Current higher education costs are 559% of what they were in 1985. Those costs, of course, don't include books, room and board, food, additional classroom fees, all of which also have to have increased steeply. But Alan, might it be unfair? Might the universities simply say, well, look, it's all very well for President Obama to say that, but it's not as if you're helping the state budgets on education. We have no choice. but to increase our fees because there's no money.
Yeah. The lenders and the university both can validly claim that their hands are tied and blah, blah, blah. Quite frankly, I think that we know they've been going to the well way too much, and the lenders are, frankly, disgusting. But nonetheless, pointing the finger where it actually needs to point goes right back to the Department of Education, because the Department of Education has a duty to warn both Congress and the public when defaults are getting too high, right? When prices are rising, and they'll know that because the default rate is getting too high. But yet they failed to do this for decades. The default rate was well over 25%. Today it's probably approaching 40 or something. The Department of Education stuck to this metric called the cohort default rate, which is a small fraction of the true default rate. So people would ask, including Congress, when they were deciding should we raise the federal loan limits, they would turn to the Department of Education and say, well, you know, should we raise them? How are the defaults doing? Department of Education would say, oh, defaults are doing great. They're 4%. They weren't 4%. They were like 25%.
But what was going on? How do you explain that?
I can't explain it. Ask the Department of Education. If you look at all of their press releases discussing defaults going back 20 years or maybe even more, you will not find any that talk about the actual default rate for student loans. Instead, you find only the cohort default rate advertised. And this, too, was advertised by the schools and by the lenders. So the borrowers were completely misled into thinking these were quite safe loans, you know, 4% default rate, that sounds pretty good, right? What they weren't told was that there was about a 1 in 4 chance on average that they would wind up in default.
This is becoming, this is sounding more and more like the subprime thing. But Pat, very quickly, we only got 3 minutes left. I'll say, Pat, you had something to say on that thing.
Just to answer your question, the reason that those numbers look so goofy is because the Department of Education would only look at 2 years after graduation. So if you were defaulting, and in some cases 3 and 5 years, but if you were defaulting after that, you just dropped off the map. You weren't part of the data.
All right, well, let's look at some of the things that the Obama administration is doing. It has made several proposals to reduce the burden of student loans backed by government guarantees. A pay-as-you-earn scheme will reduce monthly payments by capping them at 10% of income after the basics of food and shelter. Students with more than one loan will be able to consolidate them, reducing the risk of default. The president has also called on Congress to extend a tax credit that's due to expire in June that would double interest rates if it does expire to 6.8%. Victor Sanchez, is that doing the trick then? Is that what you want? What do you want?
It's definitely a step in the right direction, but I think, again, these are band-aids to much larger issues, and the interest rate is set to double for Stafford loans come July. There's a big fight right now to try and get that a part of the budget, to try and have that be solved. Right now, that's a more immediate solution that the president supports and that we're moving forward to try and help solve, but there's a much larger solution that needs to be had. And you know, for us, it's about pushing this idea that Representative Hanson Clark from Michigan has around totally reforming what the loan repayment system can look like in H.R. 4170, which is a bill that he's going through called the Student Loan Debt Forgiveness Act of 2012, and basically realigning what it would mean to repay student loans and saying that if you can repay on time in 10 years, you can have your loans forgiven, and your payment will be based on your income, a percentage of what your income could look like, not making it an unfair burden on what you're paying. And so, I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but I think ultimately we need a much larger solution.
It's strange because, Alan Collinge, that seems to be moving closer to some systems we see in Europe, and yet weirdly, people in governments in Europe seem to be getting closer to the American system, if anything, aren't they?
Well, here is the fundamental problem right now with all these great-sounding repayment programs that we're hearing about. The Department of Education does not want to forgive this debt. They do not want to. And these programs are untested, unproven, and there's a million ways that borrowers can be kicked out of the program or fall out. And remember, this predatory default incentive is even stronger than ever now under the direct loan program. So while these repayment programs sound good, they're never going to work in the absence of bankruptcy protections. Only with bankruptcy protections standing behind the borrower at the end of the day, should the you-know-what hit the fan, only in the presence of those protections will the Department of Education actually have the incentive to work with the borrower to promote success and successful repayment through any number of very generous and very promising repayment programs and others. Comes down to bankruptcy, guys.
Pat Garofalo, then, I mean, we've only got 30 seconds, but why not then institute bankruptcy protection? Is it simply the usual story of Washington lobbying, preventing
Because getting
common sense,
any
or?
bankruptcy reform that make the system better through Congress is quite a task, and it's a thankless task for the most part, because the people who are voting and the people who are, more importantly, making political donations don't actually care about it at all.
Final thought?
Yeah, and I think again it's a testament to how powerful the lobby is, for these interests. If you're able to say student loans are exempt, you can't get those forgiven during bankruptcy, but gambling debt can be, there's something fundamentally wrong with that.
Victor Sanchez, thank you very much. Pat Garofalo, thank you. And in Seattle, Washington, Alan Collinge, thank you very much too. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program.